But your dad had a slightly different route to Great Britain. Could you explain that?
Yes, well, my father was born and brought up in Milan, and it was a normal Italian family. He went to school in Milan, he went to university, studied law at university in Milan, and did the qualifying exams to become a practicing barrister in the Milan law courts. And he started practicing as a barrister in the mid-30s. He was born in 1913, so he graduated very early. Of course, he did the exams. He was very ambitious, and so he didn't delay in completing his exams. And he started practicing in 1934, 35. More, I think, was the year where he actually received the title of procuratore. In the years from then, the Italian government, the fascist government in power at the time, introduced laws against the Jews. And my father's family counted as a Jewish family because Limentani is a Jewish name, particularly on his mother's side. My paternal grandmother's surname was Levi. And so he was considered, by the standards that were defined in the anti-Semitic laws that were passed in 1938, I believe, a Jew to all intents and purposes, which meant that apart from all the other things that Jews were not allowed to do, he could no longer practice as a barrister. And his name was struck off the official list, the albo, of barristers in the spring of 1939. And he took the decision at that time to leave Italy, and after a certain amount of reflection, decided to go to Britain, because Britain was not allied with Germany. The war hadn't been declared yet at that time, but Britain was clearly not allied with Germany. And so he felt that there he would be able to live more freely than he would have been able to do so in Italy. And so, much to his parents' disappointment, and so he left his two elderly parents behind and his younger brother, and left Italy for the UK in June of 1939, and landed after a long train journey, landed from the cross-channel ferry in Dover, with £27 in his pocket, and a letter from some letters from a number of language schools, because he convinced the immigration officer at Dover that he was not coming to live in the UK, but simply coming over for a short period to study English. Once he'd been let in with a tourist visa, he went to London and set about looking for work. And
did your dad already speak English before he went to Great Britain then?
Well, he spoke scholastic school English, no more than that.
So, having left his elderly parents in, like you said, your dad was, what was the word you described your dad? Because he'd done his exams quite early.
Procuratore.
But he
qualified. Yes, he was a qualified barrister, and very ambitious to go ahead with that.
Obviously, here he couldn't fulfil his ambitions then.
Well, yes, he didn't want. It wasn't his lifetime ambition to be a lawyer. He'd studied law and gone into the law practice, pushed by his father. My father always wanted to be an academic. He wanted to study Italian literature, Italian history, and having finished his law degree, before he left Milan, he did a second degree in Italian literature. And when he arrived in the UK, one of the first things he did was to enrol in London University for a PhD, which he did during the war years.
During the war years?
Yes.
As well as working for the BBC?
Yes.
Very ambitious.
Yes. A hard worker.
And his initial time in England, how did he fit in? Was he seen as a refugee, or did he just immerse himself into he found himself a job straight away by the sounds of things?
It took a few months. He wrote a large number of letters asking for jobs, and one he wrote to the BBC completely in the dark. He struck lucky and got a job because at the time the BBC wanted to increase the size of their Italian broadcasting operation. And so in the space of a very short number of months, it more than doubled in size. And he was, I would say, very much an Italian person. He learned, or his English greatly improved, and by the time he left the BBC in 1945 and joined Cambridge University, he'd become much more anglicised. But I would say that during the war years he was still more Italian than English, not just in his aspect, but also in his appearance, but also in his way of speaking and his way of relating to other people.
So he embraced Britain very, very much.
Very much so. Yes, he found it a hospitable country, and he was so much so that my mother was British.
So did it in this period leading up to Italy's declaration of war, he was working for the BBC at that point there.
He joined the BBC in September 1939.
So, and however many months later, in June the 10th, Italy declares war, but because he still has Italian citizenship, he becomes overnight an enemy alien.
Right.
Did he ever tell you his feelings in that period of uncertainty there, leading up to the war, or Italy's entry, how he thought he would be treated, or what the future had in store for him in Great Britain?
Yes, you must bear in mind that working for the BBC meant that when he was taken on, he had to go through a whole vetting process. Having passed that and been taken on as a full-time BBC employee, once the war started, his job was classified as an official war job. He assumed, wrongly as it turned out, that the fact that his job was an officially classified war job and that he had been vetted meant that he was above all the discussion that was going on about the potential internment of enemy aliens and German and Italian citizens in the UK. So he observed this process, convinced for the whole period of time that the discussions about the discussions would not touch him personally.
So in effect, he was one of the few people, not directly from the War Office, but from the BBC, who had a tribunal to vet him to see if he was employable for the BBC.
Certainly.
And so I'd imagine it must have come as a big shock to him then, from what I've read there, on the 13th of June, when two officers came to pick him up. Did he ever tell you about the on that day when he was arrested? I imagine he did. Could you tell me more what he told you about that episode?
Well, he said that early in the morning, when he was still in bed, two police officers rang at the doorbell of the flat where he was staying, and told him politely but firmly that he had to accompany them to the police station. And he was given time to dress and to pack a few belongings, but told not that it wasn't necessary to take very much, because probably he wouldn't be there have to stay away very long. But he was certainly very surprised, because he knew certainly at that point that he was being arrested because of the internment laws, but assumed still that because his job was a war job, that his arrest was a mistake, and that it would only be a question of hours, or at worst a couple of days, before he would be released.
So he was still very optimistic about his position within Britain.
Yes.
So it may have come as a great shock when he ended up at Lingfield.
Certainly, yes. He had hoped that his trip would simply be to the police station and then back home, but that wasn't to be, and he was taken to Lingfield, where he told the commander of the internment camp what his position was, repeatedly, but to no avail, because he said the confusion that reigned at the time in trying to put together lists of internees, and the confusion was such that individual circumstances simply were not taken into consideration.
Did he ever explain where the confusion lay? Was it in the amount of people that he found himself amongst, or was it the lack of knowledge on why he himself had been interned? Because there was no charges, he'd just been detained. Because I know that there's other people from my interviews who explain this confusion. But did he ever tell you why it was such a confusing situation at the time?
He said certainly the number of internees was an important element, and the fact that the lists of internees had been compiled extremely hurriedly. There had been very little time to put together lists of Italian and German citizens, and so no or very little consideration had been given to individual circumstances. And as he himself states in a letter that he wrote later, his subsequent deportation was due to the fact that he was not only Italian but also single, unmarried.
Right, and I've seen that written in the cabinet meetings
Right.
of the
Right.
War Office. I'd imagine he became rather despondent then when he was taken to Wharf Mills before deportation, because I know that of all the conditions that some of the internees experienced, the conditions at Wharf Mills are the ones that they remember the most as being the most least favourable to them.
Yes.
Did he ever describe to you how long he stayed there, first of all, and then the conditions?
He did, and in the published accounts that he wrote, and he tells of the conditions in Wharf Mills, well, Lingfield as well. Lingfield being a race course that had been turned into an internment camp, he was sleeping in a horse box. So with all the hygienic, or lack of hygiene that you can imagine from a horse box. Wharf Mills was even worse, and he wrote of the grease on the ground and on the floor, and the fact that they had bags filled with straw instead of pillows and mattresses, and certainly, and the food was also criticised. Would you be interested if I read what he wrote on that subject?
I'll read it later on if that's okay. But did Wharf Mills present an opportunity for your dad to ask for help from the outside with regards to his situation? Was he able to write from Wharf Mills?
He was able to write. I don't know whether it was from Lingfield or from Wharf Mills. I think it was from Lingfield, because he then received, many months later, a letter that was addressed to him in Lingfield internment camp A, written by a colleague at the BBC saying, "We'll get your release order implemented as soon as possible." So his BBC colleagues knew that he had been taken to Lingfield, but they didn't know in real time what happened to him after that.
And what happened to him after that was being taken to Liverpool?
He was taken to Walt Mills, and then from there to Liverpool.
And at Liverpool he was on the dockside, being shepherded along into a huge ship. Did he ever describe to you the scenes on the docks before boarding the Arandora Star? Exactly what he saw?
Well, he described when he told of his experiences. He described of his feelings on seeing the ship because he recognised the ship, having already seen it a number of years earlier. The Arandora Star had been, up until a few months earlier, a luxury cruise liner, and he had seen it moored in Venice, in the just opposite St Mark's Square, by the Giardini Pubblici. And he recalled having thought at the time how nice it would be to have a cruise in a luxury ship like that, but that then in those circumstances at Liverpool the prospect seemed a lot less appealing. Added to the fact that they didn't know where they were going. Nobody had told the internees where they would be taken, and so there was a lot of speculation among the deportees about where they were going, and the general opinion seemed to be that they were going to the Isle of Man. So they embarked on the Arandora Star thinking they were going to the Isle of Man.
Of course, we know subsequently, in retrospect, that they weren't. They were going to Canada. Now, with regards to his... these are quite difficult questions for you to answer because obviously you weren't there, but this is... Hopefully your dad would have said stuff like this. Did he ever tell you how they were allocated their accommodation on the Arandora Star, or did it just seem random and they were all just pushed in up the queue, or were people's names read out in order to embark on this? Did he ever tell you what process that was?
No, he didn't say how the cabins or the accommodation were allocated. All he said was that he was in a cabin on, I believe, A deck, together with a number of other internees, and that the cabin door was locked and that there was a guard outside in the corridor. But that the internees were separated by nationality, so the Germans and the Italians were not mixed with each other.
Now, A deck, I believe, is below.
Yes.
So your dad was on the bottommost deck.
Yes.
Right. So on the ship for the first day, was he allowed to leave the deck and go up onto, say, E deck? I think E deck is in the open air. Was he allowed to see how to negotiate himself through the ship? He
did go up, certainly, because he tells in his account that he saw once the Arandora Star had set sail from Liverpool, that at a certain point he could see from on one side the Irish coast, on the other side the Scottish coast. So he realised they were going out into the Atlantic.
Right.
But he noticed. Said that he noticed a few particulars about the ship, in particular that the lifeboats seemed to be in lousy condition as far as maintenance was concerned, and that there was a lot of barbed wire around. But I don't think he made a mental note of where the escape routes were or anything like that, because nobody expected, or none of the prisoners expected, that they would have had to abandon ship so soon after.
So your dad then finds himself on A deck, 6 o'clock in the morning when the torpedo strikes. And how does he manage to get off the ship that's then sinking? Did he explain how from A deck he might have reached a lifeboat or a life jacket?
Well, he says what happened when the torpedo struck was that there was a great noise, and the whole ship shook, and the lights immediately went out. Although there weren't any lights on in his cabin, there were lights coming from under the door, from the corridor, and they went out. And so they realised that something very serious had happened. They thought they'd hit an iceberg, although that was rather unlikely, off the Irish coast in the early days of July. And since it was clear that something very serious had happened, he got must have been a life jacket in the cabin, and he grabbed that and groped his way along the corridor, because the guard obviously had left his post once the torpedo had struck, and so there was no restriction on movement. And he groped his way along the dark corridor, and decided the best thing to do was to go to the highest point in the ship. So in the chaos, he did manage to find his way up to the top deck, which was E deck, as you say, in order to ascertain whether the ship was in fact sinking or not. And when he got there was little doubt that it was, because it was beginning to tilt more and more. And so his next thought, I mean, he behaved in a very rational fashion. He was a very rational man. And his next thought was, what's the best way to abandon ship so as not to incur in injury, having seen that people who simply leapt off one of the decks were in many cases seriously injured when they landed in the water, because they hit some pieces of debris or because the jump was simply too high. I mean, jumping off E deck was like jumping out of the 4th floor of a building, and it's something that can seriously injure somebody who's not a practiced diver. So he, having discarded the lifeboats, because some of them had been launched, some of them had been launched badly, and there was in any case a run on the lifeboats, he found himself first a piece of rope, but then, dissatisfied with that, found himself a rope step ladder, and went or climbed down this into the water on his own. His main preoccupation at the time being to swim as far away from the Arandora Star as possible, so as not to be caught up in the when it went down, and be sucked down when the ship itself went down. And he grabbed hold of a piece of wood that was a piece of wreckage that was floating around, a table or a bench or something like that. And with this table or bench, this piece of wood, acting as a support, swam further and further away from the ship. Although he says that he couldn't resist turning round to see what was happening, and the horrible, fascinating spectacle of it gradually going down, and in particular the moment when it sank, when the many hundreds of people who had remained on board rained down into the water, and that was the moment when most people were killed, obviously. And he said that was a terrible moment to observe, but it was the sort of spectacle you couldn't turn away from. And then he was joined on his piece of wood by another survivor, and they were trying to identify where the lifeboats were at this stage. The lifeboats had dispersed over quite a wide area, and the wreckage too was dispersed over quite a wide area. And also there was quite a swell in the Atlantic, so you couldn't actually see the horizon all the time because of the waves. And it was only after quite a while that they spotted a lifeboat in the distance and started to swim in that direction, pushing their piece of wood in front of them. And at a certain point, his fellow survivor decided to go it alone and abandon the piece of wood and swim off on his own. And my dad continued with the piece of wood for a while and decided after a while that he too would abandon the only thing that was in the world which was providing him with any form of support, namely this piece of wood, and swim for the lifeboat, which he did. And he must have been in the water for about a good 2 hours.
And there was enough room on this boat for him?
No, there wasn't. And it was at that stage that he made the only mistake, if you like, of the whole episode, namely when he approached the lifeboat, which was already overfilled and didn't have any room on it. He shouted out "aiuto" in Italian, and a number of the passengers on board said, no, we can't take on Italians, we can only take on British survivors. But they were overruled by the second in command of the Arandora Star, Mr. Tulip, who said, no, we're at sea. At sea, any survivor has to be rescued independently of where he comes from, so you take him on board. And so he was taken on board and shoved under with 2 or 3 people sitting on top of him. And he says then he managed to find a seaman's jacket to wrap around himself to keep himself warm.
Until they were rescued? Until
a number of hours later, the St. Laurent picked them up, yes. Firstly, before the St. Laurent appeared, an aeroplane flew overhead and fired a rocket to show that it had seen them. And another 2 or 3 hours passed before the St. Laurent arrived on the accident scene. And they were picked up from the lifeboat in mid-afternoon.
And from there taken to Greenock? Yeah.
They were taken to Greenock in Scotland.
You might want to take a...
Yeah. There was just one episode I wanted to tell you before then. Before he reached the lifeboat, when he was still swimming in the water with his piece of wood, he says he remembered 2 things went through his mind. One was the parting words of his father before he left Milan train station, saying, "Don't take any risks. Be careful. Don't do anything I wouldn't do." And he couldn't help smiling, thinking of the words of his father, because his father wouldn't have been very pleased to see him where he was. And then the other episode, which he himself recounts in his written account of the sinking and the rescue, is of his observation of the waves. He says he looked at the waves and thought of lines of a poem by Manzoni, Cinque Maggio, which tells of the movement of the waves above somebody who's swimming in the water, who's been shipwrecked. And he starts to recite this poem. And then at a certain point he gets stuck. He can't remember how it continues. And he thinks, oh well, I'll just have to look it up when I get back home. And there you can understand sort of the strength of the man who in a situation like that is quite convinced that he's going to get back home one day and will be able to look up how the poem continues. Anyway, he once the St. Laurent had picked them up, and they received some medication on board the ship. Although they weren't given, the ship obviously wasn't equipped to feed and clothe them, because, I mean, for instance, he had lost his shoes and socks, and he was given just biscuits and a glass of rum, and taken to, as you said, to Greenock, to Meanskirk Emergency Hospital. And he went to Meanskirk Emergency Hospital because he had, on the suggestion and advice of some of the fellow survivors of the shipwreck, pointed out that his feet were swollen and that he had suffered by virtue of having been in the water for too long. And so he was admitted to hospital. And those who didn't ask to be admitted to hospital were embarked the very next day on the Dunera, which had, as you know, an equally troubled voyage to Australia. So he escaped going to Australia by a whisker, only by virtue of the fact that he had asked to be taken to the hospital. He says at the hospital they were treated extremely well because they were the first real patients who had arrived there. And so they were given clothing, although the clothing didn't fit, but at least it was clothing, and a bed and food and drink.
And then your dad's future didn't lie in Australia. Events which were started, about a month before, finally caught up with him. The letters for his release began to have some impact, because then he went back to his former employment, the BBC. Can you tell us a bit more about that, please?
Yes. Well, the order for his release at the BBC, the order for his release had been given by the Home Office on the application of the BBC, as soon as they knew that he had been interned. So before the Arandora Star sinking. However, in the light of all the confusion, this release order never reached the people who should have implemented it, because he was, as it were, always one step ahead of them. By the time it reached Lingfield, he was no longer in Lingfield, and by the time he was on the Arandora Star, it was beginning to be forwarded maybe to Wart Mills, and by the time he was in Meanskirk Emergency Hospital, they thought he had been drowned in the sinking. So he remained in Meanskirk Emergency Hospital, and he wasn't allowed to send any letters or telegrams or cables to the BBC to tell his colleagues where he was. And it wasn't until he was transferred from Meanskirk Emergency Hospital to Donaldson internment camp near Edinburgh that he was allowed to contact the BBC. And it was only then that they were able to ascertain that he was still alive and hadn't been killed, and have the release order, which had already been signed, sent to Donaldson internment camp, so finally to catch up with him. And he was in fact the first prisoner to be released from that internment camp, and a soldier took him personally by tram to Edinburgh train station and put him on a train to London. And the next day he was back at the BBC at the microphone.
Helping the war effort on behalf of the Allies?
Yes, very definitely.
What was his role at the BBC during the war, as opposed to pre-war now?
Well, the BBC broadcast a mixture of news programmes and what we would today call propaganda, or they called them at the time features, which were either political commentaries or conversations, imaginary conversations with a political content, political overtones, about the attitude of the Italian government to Germany, to the Allies, to the war in general. The Italian team was not enormous. It must have comprised 18, 20 people in all. And so all the members were involved both on news programmes and on the features. And my father would have been involved certainly on both. He read news broadcasts regularly when he had shift duty that day, and he wrote and took part in as a speaker in a number of the feature programmes, which broadcast to wartime Italy with what we would now, I think, consider almost caricatures. But at the time, you must imagine, they didn't have television. The only source of news was either the newspaper or the radio. So people's imagination worked on a very different way to the way it does today. And for instance, one of the programs which my father wrote and also took part in was called Le Conversazioni dell'Asse, where it's a conversation between an arrogant German who, in this case, was played by Lord Weidenfeld, who then subsequently became a publisher, Weidenfeld and Nicholson, and my father, whose role was that of Il Commendator Mancini, a rather ineffective Italian who was continuously overruled and trampled on by this arrogant German who told him, how the world really was. And another program that my father took part in was a series of programs, a series of broadcasts, where the speaker was Harold Stevens, known as Colonel Stevens or Il Colonnello Buonasera. This was political commentary, and my father wrote a number of the broadcasts, and the remainder were written by, I think probably the majority were written by Aldo Cossuto, who was another member of the Italian team in the BBC, and broadcast with a very strong English accent in Italian by Harold Stevens, Il Colonnello Buonasera. And they had a very wide influence, I would say, to the extent that when the Allied troops arrived in Sicily, they found a huge graffiti, sort of carved into the side of a hill. Viva il Colonnello Stevens, up with Colonnello Stevens. And obviously the Americans, in the first instance, didn't know who this Colonnello Stevens was. They said that we don't have a Colonel Stevens in our army, until they realised the reference was to the Colonnello Stevens of Radio Londra, who had a very, very popular following.
And after your dad's assistance to the Allies and the end of the war in 1945, he achieved great prominence in Great Britain afterwards. He left the BBC and then went to work in what he always wanted to do, academia. So he ended up, he applied for a job at Cambridge University.
Well, while he was at the BBC, he did his PhD, and in September 1945, the end of September 1945, left the BBC to do, as you say, what he always wanted to do, namely teach, and joined Cambridge University as a lector, which is the most junior teaching post, which meant taking a cut in salary of at least 50%, but at least doing what he wanted, because he said he remained at the BBC for as long as he was fighting the cause of against fascism and against all that he saw as being wrong in Italy. But having done that, he didn't want to be a journalist. So he said, once that was finished, the work in the BBC would have changed, so he preferred to leave. Although he remained in close contact with his former colleagues in the BBC, and for at least 2-3 years afterwards broadcast a regular letter from Cambridge, or lettera da Cambridge, for the Italian service, where he told of sort of rather more harmless episodes of university life. And I accompanied him on a couple of broadcasts on various subjects. So he still continued working sort of on a occasional freelance basis with the BBC, but his vocation was another one, was that of teaching.
This episode of internment and him surviving the Arandora Star, I know you were born after this episode, so this is what he told you. This is probably for my benefit rather than for the benefit of the viewer. What was your initial? When did he tell you this story that he'd left Italy in 39 and then been interned? What did you make of it all when you first heard it?
Well, he told it on a number of occasions, and certainly when I was a small boy, it was a story that I'd heard many times. But at that age, it was very difficult to understand what anti-Semitism was, what it meant to have to leave your family, leave your country, and abandon all that you'd worked for up till then, and start again from scratch. So, I mean, he underplayed that. He doesn't ever, in none of his accounts does he give an impression of being in any way a victim. It's just seen as sort of forza maggiore, something that happens, destiny. It's something that you have to react to. So it wasn't considered an immense tragedy, or at least he didn't speak about it that way. And the Arandora Star episode itself, since for us children, for me and my brothers, it obviously was a story with a happy ending, because otherwise he wouldn't have been there to tell it. It wasn't a story that sort of shocked us or took our breath away. It was while we were children, it seemed just like an episode of family folklore, because it was something that nobody else had ever heard of. And so there was no point in telling it to other people, because nobody in England, in Italy, or Germany, if we'd been to Germany, would have known what we were talking about if we had recounted that. This is something that has changed very recently, and I would say it began to change when my father gave the first account, TV account in Alfio Bernabé's program, Dangerous Characters, and the level of public recognition increased, at least in Italy, increased exponentially after Maria Serena Balestracci's book of Arandora Star, La tragedia dimenticata, was published and reviewed in the national press by Gian Antonio Stella. And it was a rather curious experience for me to go through, because it involved seeing an episode that I'd hitherto considered sort of a private family affair suddenly become a public affair. And I think it's very right that it should happen, and on reflection, it's extraordinary that it hasn't happened before.
For me, making this self-funded documentary, this is for my own interest, and hopefully some other people would be interested in this as well. What's the message that you think your dad would most want to come from this? The fact that the story's told, and what guidance do you think your dad would, if your dad was here today, would say to someone like me who has no link really to this episode, apart from the fact that my parents are Italian and I was born in Britain, and like many of these internees, they found themselves in this situation. What do you think your dad would want this programme to show?
I think he would. There would have been two aspects that he would have talked about from his personal experience. One would have been the key word communication. Communication, which was something that he himself was very conscious of practicing at the BBC, in the sense of talking to the Italians, telling the truth as to what happened in various war episodes, because and the BBC was followed in Italy because it told the truth. It gave the bad news as well as the good. So communication was something he was very conscious of. And I think he considered that the whole episode of internment and the subsequent tragic consequences of that could have been avoided if within the UK's bureaucracy, among the various authorities, better communication had existed, namely if the reasons for the individual names being on the lists had been analysed more deeply before actually going and arresting the people and taking them away. And you must remember it all happened in a very short space of time, so there was great chaos and great muddle and very little communication possible between the various bodies involved. So that's one theme that I think he would have certainly underlined, and the other one is more a personal one, namely a theme of fundamental optimism, namely that even in the most adverse circumstances, you shouldn't give up. You should continue, however slim the chances of survival seem to be. And if you persevere, then things can go right at the end of the day. And I think the theme of sort of perseverance and survival was something he would have underlined as well.
That's great. I don't think I've got any more questions for you.
Oh.
Unless you can think of anything that you'd like to add.
No, I'd like to add, yes, one thing, that I've been asked whether, as a result of the Arandora Star episode, my father was changed in any way, and whether, as a result of that, he had hostile feelings towards the British, in particular the British government, in any way. And the answers are yes and no, respectively. Namely, he says himself that to some extent the Arandora Star represented a turning point in his life, and that you couldn't witness the sudden death of so many hundreds of people without being touched very deeply by that. And so that certainly was a sudden and I think rather brutal way of achieving a very mature outlook on the frailty of life, as it were. With regard to his his attitude and his relationship with the British authorities, he never held it against them. I mean, that sounds maybe a too simplistic a way of putting it, but he didn't hold a grudge against the British for the whole business of internment and the Arandora Star. It may seem surprising, but he was able to accept that muddle happens, and that this was due principally to certainly to a faulty political analysis of the role and the situation of Germans and Italians in the UK, followed by muddle and bureaucratic muddle. And he says it was no more than that, so you shouldn't try to read into it designs or intentions that go beyond that. It simply wasn't. He says, what is sad, I think he was saddened that afterwards the lessons were learned but not recited in public, because the internment laws were certainly relaxed a few months later, as far as I recall, but the official reports on the whole process leading up to the Arandora Star and the sinking of the Arandora Star certainly don't well, I think it's fair to say they could be considered whitewash, in particular the Snell report. And as a result, I think he was disappointed that there wasn't a public apology by the government at the time. But as I say, that was not a consideration that made him in any way hostile to the British, so much so that in 1946 he became a naturalised British subject and actually swore allegiance to His Majesty George VI. So there you are.
Right, so there's lots to think about there. Lots to think about. I suppose maybe I didn't actually ask that question to Graziella, seeing as her dad was lost on the Arandora Star. Maybe she might have a different view.
I think at the time, she, as a young girl, faced with the indifference and the unwillingness of the British authorities to provide any form of information, would give you a different view. She would, because once my father got back to London, he really didn't have anything more to do with the British authorities on that episode, apart from asking for reimbursement of the financial loss on the loss of property he had suffered, to which they gave a forthright no as a reply. But I mean, it ended there as far as he was concerned, so much so that he gave one talk in the BBC about for the Home Service for the sinking of the Arandora Star, but no more than that. They were much more concerned with current events, current war events involving Italy and Germany and the UK. So it was almost as though once it was behind him, he left it that way and didn't focus on it. Whereas for Graziella, who lost her father, that would certainly have been a landmark event for her, that she would have wanted to have as the clarity which nobody was able to give her, nobody was willing to give her at the time, and that certainly would have been a source of bitterness and sadness.
And not just then, but now as well.
Certainly.
I've written numerous letters to the Home Office asking for files to be released, and I'm having some problem, I'd say some problem, in getting the ones I want.
Uh-huh.
There's a file on the analysis of the embarkation list.
Yes.
Of the Arandora Star, and on this file there are Jewish refugees from Austria which then was part of Germany, who were upgraded from Category C to Category A. Sorry, from Category B to Category A. As tenuous as your dad was at Wharf Mills, Italian and single, because unlike the Italians, the Jewish refugees from Austria and Germany did have tribunals at the start of the war. To make up the numbers that the Home Office wanted to deport, the ones who in the little notes had shown any type of resistance were classed as enemy aliens A and marked for deportation. These files I can get hold of. I can get hold of these files. I've asked for the on some of the files that they sent me, there's sections missing, so under section 3.4 they can retain these sections. So I wrote directly to the Home Office where these files were retained and asked them to be sent to me. They did, but they still pertain to Austrian refugees. I asked them for the Italians ones, so they phoned me up, and I had a very long conversation with one of the people from the Home Office there, and I said, I'm interested in the Italian list. I've got some of the German list, I've got some of the Austrian list. I can see why these people, according to the Home Office, were deported. But what I need to know is, for the accuracy of the documentary, I need to know why some of these Italian people were put on this ship for deportation. But unfortunately, what seems to have happened is it says on one of the sheets from the Home Office that a file has gone missing in transportation. Now I said to him, I need to know whether that file there is the file that pertains to the Italian internees. Because if it's a file that pertains to the German and Jewish one, it means to still hope that this file still might be around, if one was ever created. I'm assuming one was created. Yeah. So he said, leave it with me, Mr. Paolini. I'll phone up the National Archive to see if it's in their depository but hasn't been released yet. So that's at the stage I'm at. So I might very well be able to give Graziella and 4 of the other people whose fathers were on the Arandora Star in writing why their dads were put. But I don't think I will, because it seems to me that the people who had a tribunal and then were upgraded to Category A, there's a file there. But with the Italians, MI5 made a list which was based on people who had membership of the Fascio and a list of Italian single men. So there was no tribunal. Yes. So maybe no file was created in the first place.
Yes. Could be.
But I'll still persist.
Yes.
Until they say to me, we don't have a file, then that's when I'll end the inquiry. Because it would be good to know, it would be good to tell for the documentary why.
Well, in one of my father's letters, which you've seen, my father writes that he was told that he was interned because he was Italian and unmarried. He was certainly not a member of the Fascio, and neither in Italy nor in the UK. I can guarantee for that. And even though at London the fascist club was a circolo sociale, it was a social club more than a political organisation.
Yes, I've spoken to a few people who've just said it was more of a social club. Probably a social club for veterans of the First World War.
Yes.
Because the ages on the Arandora Star, 55 average for the Italians. I'll turn this off now.
That's all right.
Is it clicking?
No.
We've got 2 minutes left on this tape.
Okay.
So.
My father knew or made some friendships, more in Linkfield and in Wart Mills, which he then maintained afterwards, because the Italians amused themselves some of the Italians amused themselves in the internment camps by doing readings of literature or cultural events. And on that occasion he met and made friends with Charles Forte, who then built up the hotel empire, and a number of other people. And he used to jokingly say, "Oh yes, I met him in prison," or "We made friends when we were in prison together." And it was actually a very mixed bag. There were people from all walks of life, some very, very educated people, and some people from who were I don't know, miners who had gone to the UK for economic reasons.